So today's video is going to be on the discussion of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, so the conflicts in the Middle East over the last number of years. I'm going to briefly break down the costs, specifically that the United States has sort of taken on as a result of these conflicts, talk a little bit about why they actually got into these conflicts, and then highlight two very important points sort of at the end of the video as a recap of the discussion. So starting off, talking a little bit about what the costs of these conflicts for America actually were. And there were a number of other countries that engaged in these wars, and these costs are specifically related to the United States. And these numbers come from a Brown University study. And they also, within these numbers, they do include all direct and indirect costs associated with the wars. So within these numbers, you do have the direct costs of, say, the armored vehicles and all of the weaponry and everything on the ground. You also have homeland security defense costs, because that is almost directly related to the destabilization of the Middle East. You have veteran benefits, and you have interest on debt that was taken on to fund the war. All of that is within these numbers. So, from 2001 to 2017, America has spent $4.8 trillion on the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and all of their sort of military action in the Middle East. And this $7.9 trillion, that is by an estimated cost by 2053. And within this number, you have the $4.8 trillion plus $1 trillion estimated for veteran expenses when it comes to medical costs and all other benefits that veterans and servicemen get from that. And it also, the rest of that is then interest, because America didn't actually have the money to go to war, they had to borrow it. And borrowing has consequences, and that interest is going to be in the trillions that they are going to pay over the next number of years. And so that's sort of a breakdown of these costs, and I understand it's very difficult to sort of quantify and really understand what $1 trillion is, and it's the same for me. When I look at 4.8 trillion, 7.9 trillion, I can't even really sort of quantify or understand the difference between a billion and a trillion or visualize. I understand that obviously there's a massive gap between them, but it's very difficult to actually understand how much money that is. And I'm going to try and use two analogies that will hopefully sort of make it a little bit more understandable about how expensive these wars were. So, sort of a fun fact almost. For $1 trillion, if you were to stack $1,000 bills on top of each other, one by one, continuously, until you had $1 trillion worth, it would be a 63-mile-high tower of paper bills. These are pieces of paper stacked one on top of each other. And at $1 trillion, you'd have it something that was 63 miles high. $1,000 bills. That's a massive amount of money. And to sort of provide a real-world, almost applicable example, in America, their GDP in 2016, so their gross domestic product, that's how much they produced when it comes to factories, when it comes to services, so it includes things like accountants' work, lawyers, doctors, everything that they produce when it comes to services, goods, products, totaled around $18.6 trillion. By 2053, these wars are going to cost almost $8 trillion. That's a lot of money that they've spent on these wars. If you want to get, there are lots of sort of resources out there if you want to get a more in-depth breakdown of these costs, but really the key point here is that they've spent a tremendous amount of money on these wars. The next point I sort of want to talk about is why did America and the Allies decide to go into these conflicts? And obviously there was trigger events with 9/11 and other things that went along with that, and sort of the initial idea is you want to bring freedom, topple these sort of dictators in the Middle East. You want to bring freedom, peace to the Middle East. Well, obviously that realistically was not the reasoning for going to war. In hindsight, that was never going to be something that realistically could happen, and that almost certainly was not the primary reason America and her allies decided to go to war. A second major idea that is kind of touted a lot is the idea that they went in to secure oil interests and get resources, because the Middle East actually has a tremendous amount of precious metals and other resources that it has. And almost certainly that was a factor in their decision making. Almost certainly that America has secured oil interests. They probably did get certain resources out of it, but I can almost guarantee that they did not get anywhere near $8 trillion worth. So, while that may have been an influencing factor, it definitely was not the primary or driving force why. And so what is the main reason that America, most likely, and again this is somewhat, well, it is opinion-based, this is what I personally see as the reason for them going to war, and that is because of the industrialized military complex in the United States and honestly worldwide too. What is that? It effectively means there is a massive industry worldwide that has a tremendous amount of power, influence, and wealth that completely revolves around war, and it requires war to survive and thrive. So within the industrialized military complex, you have all of these massive corporations that profiteer off war. So people that produce armored vehicles, ammo, weapons, anything and everything related to combat missions. And these companies tremendous benefitly when the United States and other countries are at war because they supply all of the goods and supply all of the equipment that they use in those combat missions. And that is what I see as the primary reason on why America decided to go to war. Because a lot of these companies, corporations, and entities have a lot of power when it comes to influencing politicians. And using 9/11 as justification, they were able to produce or instigate a war that has been tremendously beneficial for them monetarily. And if you've never actually seen it, I would highly recommend you check out President Eisenhower's speech from 1961. He was a president in the United States, and as he was leaving office, as a new president was coming in, one of his final speeches was one where he was talking about the industrialized military complex. And it is honestly a very chilling speech where he's sort of talking about the greatest threat that America has at that time is that there is this massive industry growing in power and in wealth that requires the world to be in a constant state of warfare to survive. And I'll leave a link actually in the description below because he does it a very eloquent job, and it is very valuable to see this. This is the President of the United States who is saying that the growth of this industry that revolves completely around war is a terrifying prospect, something that we should be very aware of. And I think it's very relevant nowadays. You look at sort of the rationale and reasoning on why it entered into these conflicts, there really isn't a lot of justification. There can be very valid justification to go to war. There can be very valid reasons. You look at World War II, perfect example. You had a madman who was doing terrifying and terrible things. There was a very real justification to go to war there. You look at Afghanistan and Iraq, it doesn't really make sense unless you have this industry that has a tremendous amount of power and influence that's saying, hey, let's go to war. We need to make money. We need conflict to survive. And that's the first major point I want to make with this video. In the world right now, the military industry is a massive player, and they have a tremendous amount of influence. So whenever you see a government or an organization that is proposing military action, combat, as a potential solution to something, you have to be very aware that there probably are ulterior motives going on there. Because there are a number of powerful people in the world that want the world to be in a constant state of warfare because that's how they make money, that's how they profit. So you have to be very aware. Again, there are valid reasons to go to war, but you have to be very aware that there are people behind the scenes that are going to benefit from this. And you have to ask yourself, does it make sense? Is there a justification, a real justification? And the second point that I really wanted to touch on with this video, and it's something I typically will talk about sort of the economic benefit or drawbacks of events that go on in each video. And when it comes to war, war is actually pretty economically beneficial. When you look at the benefits that come out of war, when it comes to production, because when you're going into war, you have to produce vehicles, weaponry, and all of the equipment that is used in that war. That's economically beneficial. You create jobs, you're creating factories, you're growing the economy. Within that as well, you typically have tremendous technological benefits. When you look at, say, all of the technologies and advancements that came out of World War II, as a result of that war, there were a number of fantastical improvements that came along with that, economically beneficial. There are a number of economically beneficial sort of side effects of war. And the point that I really want to make is, even though an event can be economically beneficial, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea. And that is something, a problem I see a lot with economists. There's almost a fanatical obsession with, if it's economically beneficial, let's do it, let's go with it. And sort of a point that I really want to highlight with the costs of war, war technically, when you look at it, is economically beneficial. But from a societal standpoint, when you look at the amount of people that are going to die, the destruction, destabilization of the countries that are in these wars, when you look at the massive amount of debt that these countries are taking on typically to fund these wars, it's not beneficial. And so typically in my videos you'll see me talk, oh, this has economic benefit. It's important whenever you're looking at that, do the economic benefits outweigh the drawbacks? And when it comes to war, they 100% do not. There is economic benefit, but the societal drawbacks are much worse. And that's sort of the points I want to highlight in this video. Be very aware whenever there is talk of going to war or combat missions that there are ulterior motives at hand. And very aware of that there is a massive industry worldwide that requires the world to be in a constant state of warfare to make money. That's kind of a terrifying thought. So you really have to be cognizant of those ulterior motives when countries are proposing to do things like that. As always, if you like the video, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow. And have a great day.